Rest now, let your body grow calm, and let the quiet gather around you. In the stillness, we'll drift toward a forgotten sultan's buried library, lost to quiet centuries. If these help you sleep, subscribe. I post a new one every night. On the night of February 13th, 1021 CE, the limestone of the Makatam Hills held the cold particular to desert elevation, a cold that sank into rock during the hours before dawn and did not release until long after the sun had climbed the eastern sky. The path that wound up through those hills east of Cairo was not a formal road. It was worn into the pale stone by repetition, by the same set of hooves returning to the same ascent, night after night, a caliph's eccentric habit rendered visible in the gradual smoothing of the rock. On this particular night, a donkey climbed that path. At some point in the darkness, the rider was no longer present. The donkey was found later, standing quietly on the pale limestone, with an empty saddle and blood-stained robes draped across it. The city's minarets just visible below in the distance. The pre-dawn quiet, unbroken by any explanation. What had happened to Al-Hakim Bi'Amr Allah, ruler of Egypt and the Levant, and North Africa, and the Hejaz, caliph of the Fatimid dynasty, and commander of the faithful, no investigation has ever established. The records of the period note his disappearance without resolving it. Whether he was killed on that hillside by enemies whose names were known or unknown, whether he arranged his own death as a performance, whether he simply left, rode down the other side of the hills, and kept riding, is a question the documentary record declines to answer. What is certain is that he left the city of Al-Qahira, the royal capital his dynasty had built, beginning in 969 CE, and that the city continued without him, and that certain things he had made continued alongside it for considerably longer than anyone at the time could have anticipated. Al-Hakim had assumed the Fatimid Caliphate in 996 CE at the age of 11. The dynasty he inherited had built Al-Qahira, the city that would eventually become the Cairo familiar to later centuries, as a walled royal enclosure north of the older settlement of Fustat, a city within a city, its palaces and mosques and administrative buildings organized around the political and religious authority of the Fatimid line. By the time Al-Hakim was old enough to exercise real independent power, he ruled over territories that stretched from the edge of the Sahara in the west to the Red Sea coast in the east, and from the shores of the Mediterranean south into sub-Saharan trade routes. The sacred cities of Mecca and Medina fell within his domain, which meant that the Fatimid dynasty, Ismaili Shia, in its theological commitments, held custodianship over the sites that Sunni Islam considered its most holy places. This was not a stable situation in any obvious sense, but stability was not the particular quality that defined Al-Hakim's reign. 9 years into his caliphate, in 1005 CE, Al-Hakim founded the Dar el-Ilm, the House of Knowledge. The building stood in Cairo, not far from the mosque that bore Al-Hakim's name, and it was stocked, according to the accounts of historians who lived close enough to the period to have consulted sources now lost, with approximately 600,000 manuscripts. The figure requires a moment to settle. 600,000 manuscripts. The number belongs to a different scale of accumulation than most medieval institutions could achieve, and the Fatimid state had the administrative reach and financial resources to make it plausible. Centuries of systematic acquisition, teams of professional copyists, networks of agents in markets across the Islamic world, and the political gravity that attracted donations and dedications from scholars who wanted their work preserved in the most significant collection available. Whether the specific number is exact in the sense that a modern inventory would be exact is a question scholars approach with reasonable caution: that the institution existed, that it operated as described, that it represented a genuine concentration of manuscript wealth. These things are not seriously disputed. What the Dar al-Ilm provided was not simply storage. Access was free. A scholar who arrived at its doors and needed to consult a text could do so without payment. Paper was available near the entrance for anyone who required it, to make notes, to copy passages, to draft correspondence. The professional staff included astronomers employed on state salary, jurists, grammarians, physicians, not merely caretakers of books, but working intellectuals whose presence made the institution a functioning center of inquiry rather than simply a well-organized warehouse. The reed mats on its stone floors, the open wooden cases along its walls, the inkwells uncapped each morning by scholars who had come not because they were summoned, but because the knowledge they needed was there. These are the ordinary details of a place that operated on a daily rhythm of serious intellectual work, and they continued through the early years of the 11th century as a quiet constant beneath the volatility of the caliph who had created them. Al-Hakim's reign was characterized by reversals of a kind that makes straightforward historical characterization difficult. He ordered the destruction of churches and synagogues in the territories under his rule, then later ordered their reconstruction and compensated communities for the damage his earlier decrees had caused. He persecuted specific communities. Coptic Christians faced restrictions during certain periods of his reign. Jewish communities faced others, and then reversed course, patronizing and protecting. He executed several of his own viziers, men who had served him at the highest levels of his administration, and appointed their successors to the same positions under similar conditions. The decrees he issued in his throne room in Al-Qahira, behind its gold-inlaid wooden doors, in the formal setting of caliphal authority, could reverse those given the month before, with no explanation that survives in the documentary record as internally coherent. Sunni chroniclers, writing under the Ayyubid rule that came after the Fatimids, had specific reasons to frame this volatility as evidence of madness. A caliph understood as deranged could be dismissed. A caliph understood as a political actor making deliberate choices, even inconsistent or terrible ones, required more complicated engagement. The historical record, as it reaches later centuries, has been filtered through perspectives that had institutional reasons to prefer one interpretation over another, and reading Al-Hakim through the sources that survived requires holding that filter in mind without assuming it explains everything. What the record shows, once the later framing is acknowledged and set to one side, is a ruler of genuine complexity whose actions followed patterns that scholars still debate, a man who could found and sustain an institution of open intellectual inquiry, while also issuing decrees that restricted inquiry in specific communities, who could fund astronomy and persecute practitioners of certain religious observances, who could create something as careful and considered as the Dar al-Ilm, and still govern in ways that left his own officials uncertain from year to year whether they would retain their positions. There is a tradition, living and respected among those who hold it, that Al-Hakim did not die on the Muqattam hills, that his disappearance was a departure in a different sense, and that he holds a place in the theology of the Druze faith that goes beyond ordinary historical memory. This tradition deserves to be named as what it is, a living religious understanding held by a real community, not a curiosity to be assessed against secular historical criteria and found wanting. The historical narration rests here only long enough to acknowledge its presence before moving on, leaving it where it belongs, in its own register, undisturbed by the documentary record that surrounds it. What the documentary record does establish is what happened to Al-Qahira after Al-Hakim's disappearance. His reign ended in February 1021 CE, and the dynasty continued for another century and a half, accumulating knowledge and manuscripts and administrative history in the royal complex that Al-Hakim had presided over. The Dar al-Ilm continued to function. The palace library grew. The city above the older settlements of the Delta continued to operate as the political and intellectual center of a significant portion of the Islamic world. For 150 years after the empty saddle was found on the limestone path, the Fatimid Caliphate persisted, and what it had assembled persisted with it. The end came in 1171 CE. Saladin, the military leader whose campaigns in the following decade would make him one of the most recognized figures in the medieval record, abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and converted Egypt back to Sunni Islam. This was not simply a change of dynasty in the way that dynasties throughout history have replaced each other through war and succession. It was a deliberate reorientation of Egypt's religious and intellectual identity, and the records of the Fatimid dynasty were subject in its aftermath to targeted treatment that went beyond the ordinary disruptions of political transition. The palace library, the collection of manuscripts that had grown over 2 centuries of Fatimid rule into something of extraordinary scope, was subject to dispersal and partial destruction. This was not incidental. It was a severing, deliberate and documented, of the Ismaili Shia intellectual tradition from Egypt's official memory. The palace complex that had housed this tradition stood in Al-Qahira exactly as it had stood for the previous 2 centuries. The doors of particular rooms were closed. The lamps went unlit. The shelves of manuscripts that had not been sold or moved or destroyed stood in the dark, while above them the city changed hands and changed faiths and went about the ordinary commerce of a large medieval urban center. What stood behind those closed doors in 1171 CE? What precisely had been dispersed? What had been destroyed? What still sat on the shelves in the unlit rooms is a question the historical record addresses only partially in the fragments of later accounts that drew on sources already incomplete by the time they were written. The Fatimid Caliphate had, from the beginning, positioned knowledge as a matter of religious and political significance. The Dar al-Ilm was not simply a library in the sense of a repository. It embodied an intellectual program, the idea that all legitimate human knowledge across all the disciplines that human inquiry had developed properly belonged within an Islamic framework that the Fatimid dynasty was positioned to provide and protect. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, grammar, music theory, these were not separate from the religious project of the caliphate, but continuous with it. The scholars employed on state salary at the Dar al-Ilm were not secular, academics in a modern sense. They were participants in a broader effort to establish the Fatimid Ismaili tradition as the proper custodian of the full range of what humanity had learned to write down. This is why the library's concealment and dispersal after 1171 CE was not simply a practical matter of books changing hands during a political transition. The manuscripts were not neutral objects. They carried the intellectual identity of a tradition that the Ayyubid dynasty had specific reasons to displace. A scroll of astronomical calculations, annotated by a Fatimid scholar, was not only a scientific document, it was evidence of a particular claim about who had the authority to pursue and preserve knowledge, and that claim was now politically unwelcome. The destruction and dispersal of such material was a form of argument, carried out in action rather than words, about whose version of Islamic intellectual history would be available to future generations. Al-Hakim himself had understood the relationship between books and authority in personal terms that went beyond institutional provision. His eccentricities as a ruler were many and well documented. His preference for nocturnal activity that sent him riding into the Mukatum hills alone in the hours before dawn, his periods of asceticism that alternated with the formal grandeur of caliphal ceremony, his sudden reversals of policy that kept his administrators in a state of perpetual uncertainty about what the next decree would require of them. But the Dar al-Ilm was not eccentric, it was considered and sustained. The open access policy, the free paper, the salaried scholars, the physical organization of the collection by subject, these required administration across years, and they received it. Whatever else al-Hakim was, he had made something that outlasted his volatility and outlasted the night he rode into the hills and did not return. The caliphal throne room in Al-Qahira, where the contradictory decrees of al-Hakim's reign were issued in sequence, is worth pausing on as a physical space. Behind its gold-inlaid wooden doors, doors that opened onto the formal ceremony of Islamic political authority, the same seat of power had produced orders that reversed earlier orders, had sent viziers to their posts and then to their deaths, had established institutions of extraordinary intellectual openness, and issued restrictions of considerable narrowness, sometimes within the span of the same year. The throne room was not a place of simple or consistent power. It was the point from which a genuinely complicated ruler administered a genuinely complicated caliphate, and the manuscripts that sat in the Dar al-Ilm, a short distance away, were partly the product of that complication, the one sustained, coherent policy of a reign that was otherwise defined by its inconsistencies. A Fatimid manuscript binding of the period conveys something of the care that went into this project. The lacquered boards in deep brown leather, the geometric stamping along the spine, the specific texture of a book constructed to survive. These were objects made with the expectation that they would outlast the people who made them. The Warakin, the professional copyists who worked within the Fatimid library system, and the Mujallidun, the bookbinders who completed their work, were not producing ephemera. They were making things intended to carry information across centuries, and the physical form of their production reflects that intention in details that survive, in the examples that have come down through the manuscript collections of later institutions. A binding made in Fatimid Cairo in the year 1010 CE, held now in the palm of an archivist's hand in a library half a world away from where it was made, carries in its structure the specific ambition of an institution that understood itself as a long-term project. The geometry of that project, its timeline, its scale, its relationship to the political authority that funded and sustained it, makes al-Hakim's disappearance something more than a personal mystery. It makes it the vanishing of the particular intelligence that had set the project in motion, leaving behind an institution whose fate would be decided by successors who had inherited its physical form, but not the specific mind that had created it. The Dar al-Ilm continued after 1021 CE. The collection continued to grow. The scholars continued to arrive and work and leave their inkwells on the copyists' tables. But al-Hakim was gone, and the empty saddle on the pale limestone path was all that remained to indicate where he had gone or why. It is worth holding for a moment the particular quality of the years between 1021 CE and 1171 CE, the century and a half in which the Fatimid Caliphate continued without its most historically distinctive ruler, and in which the library accumulated what would eventually become, according to medieval accounts, a collection of extraordinary proportions. These were not static years. The dynasty had political troubles, military pressures, internal disputes, and periods of famine and instability. The city of Al-Qaira went through the full range of changes that any large medieval urban center passes through across 150 years. But the library persisted. The institution Al-Hakim had founded in 1005 CE continued to function, to acquire, to copy, to organize, and to hold what it had been given to hold. The sealed rooms of the Fatimid Palace complex after 1171 CE are not entirely a matter of imagination. The palace itself is documented in medieval accounts that describe its layout, its scale, the organization of its various administrative and residential sections. The library existed within a complex that had been built with the permanence of stone and the ambition of a dynasty that expected to last. When the political reality changed and the Ayyubid administration took control, the physical fact of those rooms, their walls, their floors, their shelves, did not disappear. What disappeared, or was dispersed, or was buried, was what they contained. The rooms themselves remained. The doors were shut, the lamps went dark, and whatever the shelves still held stood in that darkness, while above them El-Kahira continued, its streets busy with the commerce and prayer and ordinary life of a city that had been built, stone by stone, over the course of 2 centuries, on ground that had been empty desert when the Fatimid dynasty had first staked its claim there in 969 CE. Al-Hakim bi Amra Allah had set something in motion in 1005 CE that the ground beneath El-Kahira still, in the most literal physical sense, holds. The palace area has never been comprehensively excavated. The layers of construction and occupation that have accumulated above the Fatimid foundations are dense with the deposit of centuries, Byzantine, Roman, and Pharaonic material below, Fatimid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman material above, Fatimid, Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman material above, Fatimid, Ayyubid, the continuous pressure of a modern city on top of all of it. What lies beneath those layers, beneath the floors of the old palace complex, beneath the dressed stone that the Fatimid builders laid down with the intention that it would carry weight for generations, is a question the archaeological record has addressed only in fragments. This is not to claim that the library is certainly there, that somewhere in the foundations of Old Cairo, intact and waiting, the 600,000 manuscripts of the Dar el-Ilm, or the larger holdings of the royal collection, sit in sealed cedar chests with wax-stoppered ceramic jars beside them, preserved by the specific dry conditions that the Cairo climate can produce across centuries, as the discovery of the Cairo Geniza in 1896 demonstrated was genuinely possible for material buried in this particular geography. The record does not support certainty in that direction. What the record supports is the simpler statement that the excavation has not been completed, that the ground has not been fully opened, and that the question of what is below the dressed stone has not been answered. The Dar el-Ilmav's doors, standing shut after 1171 CE, are the appropriate place to rest at this point in the account. The building was still present. The shelves, if the later accounts that speak of material remaining in the palace complex are to be believed, were not entirely empty. The question of what they held, which texts had been removed, which destroyed, which concealed, which simply left behind in the administrative confusion of a regime transition, is a question without a clean answer. It is not a question that carries urgency at this hour. It is simply an open question, specific and real, about a specific and real place, a building in a city that still exists, standing above ground, that has not yet fully given up what it was given to hold. The night of February 13th, 1021 CE, ended without the caliph. The Mukattam Hills received the ordinary light of the following morning, the limestone pale in the early sun, the path worn by years of nocturnal riding, empty of the figure who had worn it. Below, in Al-Kahira, the Dar el-Ilm opened as it had opened on every ordinary day, the reed mats laid out, the wooden cases standing along the stone walls, a scholar uncapping an inkwell somewhere near the entrance, the free paper stacked for whoever arrived and needed it. The institution continued, because institutions, when they are well enough made, continue past the people who made them. The books continued, because books, when they are well enough bound, outlast the hands that bound them. And the question of what happened to Al-Hakim on that limestone path, whether he was killed there or left of his own will, or staged something more deliberate than either simple death or simple departure, is still exactly where it was on the morning the donkey was found standing alone, with its empty saddle, waiting for an explanation that has not yet arrived, and that the record, in its quiet honesty about its own limits, offers no particular reason to expect tonight. Al-Makrizi set the number down in ink in the 15th century. He was writing in Cairo, drawing on sources that no longer survive, and the figure he recorded was 1.6 million volumes. Not manuscripts acquired over a single reign, not books displayed in a single room. 1.6 million volumes accumulated across 2 centuries of Fatimid rule, held inside the palace complex of Al-Kahira, in a collection that had grown, by the time Al-Makrizi was writing about it, into something he could only describe in aggregate as a mass, a weight, an accumulation that resisted easy characterization. Modern scholars approach that specific number with measured caution. They note that counting methods varied, that a volume might mean a single folio or a bound set of fascicles, that numbers in medieval sources sometimes track prestige as much as inventory. And then they note also that the Fatimid state's documented capacity for manuscript acquisition over 200 years of rule was real and well attested, and that the caution should perhaps be modest. The figure sits in the record. It has sat there since the 15th century. It belongs to the physical fact of what this library was. 1.6 million volumes occupies a specific kind of space. It is not a metaphor for wealth or learning. It is an actual count of objects, of pages, bindings, wooden cases, shelves, and the rooms necessary to hold all of them. It implies a building organized with some sophistication, since objects in that quantity cannot simply be stacked. They require arrangement, indexing, and a staff capable of locating any particular item within a larger whole. It implies a program of acquisition that ran continuously for generations, since no single reign could have assembled such a collection from nothing. It implies, too, a Cairo that was in the 11th century, something the rest of the Mediterranean world could only partially comprehend, a city whose palace contained more written knowledge than most kingdoms had ever thought to gather, organized and tended, and in principle available. The library sat within the palace complex of Al-Kahira, the walled royal city the Fatimid dynasty had built, beginning in 969 CE, on ground north of the older settlement of Fustat. Al-Kahira was not a public city in the ordinary sense. Its gates were controlled. Its lanes were the arteries of a court rather than a market. And within that already restricted space, the library occupied rooms whose exact position within the palace plan has never been confirmed by excavation, though the medieval sources describe the collection as spread across multiple chambers, and some of them accessible to approved scholars, and some of them reserved for the caliph's private use, the two kinds of space separated by more than just a door. What the library held in its accessible rooms was already extraordinary. What it held in its more restricted sections remains a question the record does not fully answer. The holdings that al-Makrizi and other medieval historians describe extended far beyond what one might assume a royal Islamic collection would contain. Religious texts were present, of course, Quran manuscripts in multiple scripts and formats, collections of hadith, works of Ismaili theology, and jurisprudence that reflected the Fatimid dynasty's specific position within Islam. Legal texts covered the Ismaili madhab in depth, as well as materials from other schools of Islamic law held presumably for reference and comparison. But the collection's scope did not stop there, and it did not stop at the boundaries of what religious tradition strictly required. The Fatimid intellectual program held that all legitimate human knowledge properly belonged within an Islamic framework, that astronomy and medicine and philosophy and mathematics were not foreign bodies to be quarantined, but areas of inquiry that a serious Islamic civilization should possess and extend. The library reflected this position in its shelves. Astronomy occupied a significant portion of the holdings. The Fatimid state maintained astronomers on salary, scholars employed to track celestial movements, to calculate calendars, to refine the tables known as Zij that converted astronomical observation into usable prediction. The library that supported this work would have held the major Arabic astronomical texts of the preceding 2 centuries, the translations from Greek that had entered the Arabic tradition through the work of earlier scholars, and the observational records and updated calculations that Fatimid-era astronomers had themselves produced. A working library of this kind is not simply a repository, it is an instrument. The astronomer comes to it not to admire what it contains, but to use it, to find a specific calculation, to check a previous observation, to locate the most recent refinement of a table that will be refined again by the time the next season changes. Medicine held a similar position in the collection. Fatimid Cairo maintained physicians employed by the state, and the library's medical holdings would have encompassed the translated Galenic corpus, the works of Ibn Sina that were being composed in the same period further east, the accumulated pharmacological knowledge of the Arabic medical tradition, and the clinical and dietary texts that served practicing physicians in a city of some size. These were not decorative holdings. They were tools, and the people who used them came to the library the way a craftsman comes to a workshop, with a specific problem, a specific need, and the expectation that the room would yield something useful. Philosophy occupied shelves that would have included Al-Farabi's political and logical works, the Arabic tradition of commentary on Aristotle that had been building since the translation movement of the previous century, and the Neoplatonist texts that had entered Arabic scholarship through the same channels. The Fatimid court had a particular interest in philosophical synthesis, in the reconciliation of Greek rational inquiry with Ismaili theological categories, and the library that served this project held the materials that made it possible. Mathematics was present in forms ranging from elementary calculation to the advanced geometry of the Arabic tradition. Music theory occupied a portion of the collection, as it did in every major Islamic library of the period, since music was understood as a mathematical discipline rather than simply a performing art, and its theoretical literature was considered part of the same continuous body of rational inquiry that included astronomy and optics. Alchemy was there too. It held a different status than astronomy or medicine, more contested, its claims less universally accepted, even within the tradition that produced it, but it was present in a library that understood itself as containing everything that human inquiry had generated, and it sat on its shelves without apology. Geography occupied a section that would have ranged from the broad descriptive geographies of the Arabic tradition to the specific route books and administrative gazetteers that a dynasty governing territory from Egypt to the Hijaz would have needed for practical reasons. Literature was present in a quantity that the sources suggest was considerable. Poetry collections, the narrative and epistolary traditions of Arabic prose, and works from the Persian literary tradition that had been entering the Arabic language world in this period in growing volume. All of this was organized. It did not simply accumulate. The Fatimid library maintained a hierarchy of book professionals whose specific roles the medieval sources distinguish with some care. The Qasin al-Kutub, the keeper of books, occupied the position of greatest responsibility, serving simultaneously as administrator, curator, and intellectual interlocutor for the caliph. The sources describe this role as requiring genuine scholarly credentials, not simply organizational capacity. The Qasin al-Kutub was expected to know the collection well enough to serve as a human index, to answer questions about what the library held, to advise on what acquisitions were needed, to understand the relationship between texts well enough to guide a researcher through a large and complex body of material. Beneath the keeper of books worked teams of warrakan, professional copyists, whose role in the Islamic book world was both commercial and scholarly. The warrakan occupied a position that had no precise equivalent in the European book trades of the same period. They were not simply scribes executing a commission. They were readers, critics, and sometimes authors in their own right, familiar enough with the texts they copied to catch errors, correct corruptions, and occasionally add marginal notes that themselves became part of the scholarly conversation. A major library employed warrakan on a sustained basis, and the Fatimid collection would have maintained a scriptorium in which the work of copying, correcting, and expanding the collection went on continuously, year after year, as long as the library functioned. The Mujallidun, the bookbinders, formed another distinct professional category. Fatimid binding was a recognized style with specific technical characteristics: lacquered boards in dark brown or reddish leather, geometric stamping along the spine, and boards, interior doublers, sometimes decorated with a fineness that made the binding an object of aesthetic attention as well as practical protection. A Fatimid binding meant something. It identified a book as having been produced or processed within a particular institutional tradition, gave it a physical character that distinguished it from books made elsewhere, and gave it a durability that, as the manuscripts that survive from this period demonstrate, was genuinely capable of outlasting centuries. The Muvaddilidun were not decorators. They were engineers of longevity, and the bindings they made were part of the library's implicit claim that the knowledge it held was meant to persist. The collection also employed a rotating staff of subject specialist scholars, individuals who served simultaneously as resident researchers and as guides to specific portions of the holdings. These scholars were, in a practical sense, the library's memory in motion, the people who knew not only that a particular text existed, but where it was shelved, what its relationship was to adjacent texts, which passages were disputed, and which copyist's version was considered the most reliable. This kind of distributed, embodied knowledge is one of the things a library loses when it loses its people, and it is one of the things that cannot be recovered from the books alone, even when the books survive intact. Ibn al-Haytham was working in Cairo during the years when the Fatimid library was at or near its peak. His dates in Cairo overlap substantially with the reign of al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, and the work he produced there the Kitab al-Manazir, the Book of Optics, composed between approximately 1011 and 1021 CE, is one of the most consequential scientific texts produced anywhere in the world in the 11th century. Its argument about the nature of vision, that light travels from objects to the eye rather than from the eye to objects, that visual experience is a physical process subject to geometric analysis, was not fully absorbed by European natural philosophy until its Arabic text had been translated into Latin and circulated through the universities of medieval Europe. The original Arabic manuscripts of this text, the copies produced in Cairo contemporaneous with or shortly after Ibn al-Haytham's own work, would have been among the items a comprehensive Fatimid royal library almost certainly held. Whether they were among the holdings that survived the library's later history is a question the record does not answer. Ibn al-Haytham's working method, as the Kitab al-Manazir itself describes it, required controlled conditions. He used a room with a small aperture cut into one wall through which light entered in a focused beam, and he tracked the behavior of that beam across surfaces marked to record its position and angle. The diagrams that accompany the text in its surviving manuscripts reflect this working practice, precise, geometric, and oriented toward experiment rather than simply toward argument. The library that surrounded this kind of work was not a passive repository. It was an active component of the intellectual process, the place from which Ibn al-Haytham could draw the earlier optical texts he was engaging in correcting, the place to which his own conclusions would eventually be returned in the form of finished manuscripts. The collection's multilingual character is among its most distinctive features, and it is one that becomes more striking the more carefully it is considered. The Fatimid state governed a population of diverse religious and linguistic communities, the Arabic-speaking Muslim majority, the substantial Coptic Christian population of Egypt, the Jewish communities of Cairo and Fustat, and the various Syriac-speaking Christian communities that had connections to the dynasty's territories further north. A library built to serve the intellectual life of this state could not have been, in any useful sense, monolingual. The Hebrew texts that belonged to the active Jewish scholarly communities of Fatimid Cairo would have found their way into the collection alongside Arabic religious and scientific texts, Coptic religious manuscripts, the liturgical and theological literature of the Egyptian Christian Church, occupied shelf space near Arabic astronomical Zij and Persian literary works. Syriac texts from the Christian scholarly tradition of Syria and Iraq, which had been one of the primary channels through which Greek philosophical and medical texts entered the Arabic translation movement, were present in a collection that understood the translation movement as its own inheritance. Sit with that image for a moment. A shelf in a room in Cairo, sometime around 1010 CE, holding an Arabic text beside a Syriac text, beside a Hebrew text, beside a Coptic manuscript in its cedar storage box. None of these texts is performing adjacency for the benefit of an observer. They are simply shelved according to a system the Qasim al-Kutub has established, organized by subject or by acquisition or by language, and they sit together because a library organized by the principle that all legitimate human knowledge belongs within a single frame of understanding will necessarily accumulate knowledge from multiple traditions. The adjacency is not symbolic, it is practical. It reflects the intellectual appetite of a state that collected what was useful and what was interesting in whatever language it arrived. The Coptic manuscript in its cedar box deserves a particular moment of attention. Coptic was not a growing literary tradition in the 11th century. It was a language in the long process of giving way to Arabic as the everyday tongue of Egyptian Christians, and the manuscripts that preserved the older Coptic literature were already In 1010 CE, objects of a certain antiquarian significance, in addition to their religious function. A Fatimid library that held Coptic manuscripts was holding something that the collectors who assembled it understood to be irreplaceable, text that existed in limited copies, in a language that fewer people read with each generation, representing a tradition that would not replenish itself. Placing them in cedar, wrapping them in oiled linen, setting them on shelves in a room maintained by professional librarians. This was already a form of preservation, a recognition that the objects required specific care if they were to last. The copyist table in the library's scriptorium would have been, on an ordinary working day in the first decade of the 11th century, a place of sustained and specific attention. A sheet of paper. The Fatimids maintained paper production, and the library provided free paper to scholars who needed it, laid flat on a smooth surface. An inkwell of carbon black, the kind that produced the dense lasting marks that still survive in manuscripts of this period. A reed pen cut to a specific width, its tip shaped for the Naskh script that was in this period becoming the dominant hand for scholarly and official Arabic text. A partly transcribed page of Al-Farabi's political philosophy, or a section of the astronomical tables, or a passage from one of the medical compendia, drying in the light while the copyist prepares to continue. This was not romantic work. It was sustained, physical, and skilled. It required the copyist to read ahead, to understand the text well enough to catch corruptions in the exemplar, to maintain a consistent letter form across hours of uninterrupted writing. The Warrakin, who did this work in the Fatimid library, were producing the objects through which the library's knowledge would persist beyond any single moment. Free paper at the entrance. This detail appears in the sources as a feature of the Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, that al-Hakim bi Amr Allah founded in 1005 CE, a related institution connected to the palace collection and organized along similar principles of open access and state provision. The detail is worth holding because it is unusual. Paper in the 11th century was a valuable material. Providing it without charge to anyone who came to study or to copy was a declaration about the nature of knowledge and its proper relationship to the people who sought it. The Fatimid intellectual program included this declaration that learning should not be constrained by the material cost of recording it. The paper at the entrance was not a gesture, it was policy, made physical and placed where anyone arriving at the building would encounter it first. The scholars who used the library came from across the Islamic world and beyond it. The sources describe a pattern familiar from the great libraries of any period, visiting researchers who came to consult specific texts, resident scholars who worked within the collection for months or years, and occasional figures of particular distinction who were given access to portions of the collection not available to ordinary visitors. The library served the caliphal court directly, providing the materials for the state's administrative and ceremonial functions. It served the Ismaili theological project, holding the texts of a tradition that understood esoteric knowledge as a dimension of religious life, requiring specific scholarly attention. And it served the broader community of scholars who worked in Cairo, the physicians, the astronomers, the philosophers, who needed the kind of access that only a collection of this size and organization could provide. A scholar moving through the stacks with a lamp in the late evening would have encountered something that is difficult to reconstruct from descriptions alone, and that requires, instead, a certain lateral imagination, not the silence of a modern archive, where the climate is controlled and the material is fragile, and the presence of a reader is a supervised event. Something more like the silence of a room in which the accumulated attention of many people over many years has been sedimented into objects, into the particular weight of a binding, the slight stiffness of a page that has been turned many times, the small notations and margins that earlier readers left for the next reader they would never meet. A library of that age and that scale carries within it the evidence of everyone who used it, in forms that may not be legible as such, but that are physically present in the wear of the materials and the marks on the pages. The Kazin al-Kutub, the chief librarian, would have moved through this space with a familiarity that took years to build. The sources describe the role as one of continuous attention to the physical condition of the collection, checking bindings for damage, noting which manuscripts required recopying before their exemplars became unusable, tracking the movement of volumes between sections as scholars returned and requested them, maintaining the catalog that made the collection navigable. The catalog itself was an intellectual object, a record of what the library held organized, in a way that reflected the librarian's understanding of how the holdings related to one another. To know the catalog was to know the library. To lose the catalog was to leave the books as a mass of objects rather than an organized body of knowledge. The catalog, in all probability, does not survive. The medieval historians who describe the library's holdings are drawing on sources that were themselves drawing on sources, layers of mediation between the original catalog and the descriptions that eventually reached Al-Makrizi's pen in the 15th century. What this means is that the library's own record of itself has been lost, and what remains is a sketch drawn by people who either saw the library before its dispersal and wrote from memory, or who read accounts by such people, or who read accounts of those accounts. The sketch is evocative. It is not complete. And the gap between the sketch and the thing it describes is one of the library's enduring characteristics, a collection so large that even the record of its contents is partial. The light in the library's rooms came through high, narrow windows, the kind of architectural arrangement that kept the interior cool, that prevented direct sunlight from falling on the manuscript pages, and that admitted enough diffuse illumination for reading without the damaging intensity of direct exposure. In the hours around midday in an Egyptian summer, the rooms would have been relatively dim despite the brightness outside, the light entering at a low angle through the narrow apertures and pooling on the stone floors in long rectangles that shifted slowly through the afternoon hours. In winter, the same windows admitted more of the available light, and the day's reading hours extended further into the afternoon. The scholars who worked in these rooms understood their own schedules in terms of light, knew which tasks could be done in the dimmer hours and which required the full midday brightness, and organized their work accordingly within a rhythm the building itself imposed. The wooden cases that held the manuscripts along the walls were, by the physical logic of preservation, a significant technology. Wood, in the dry Cairo climate, offered real protection against the insects and moisture that destroyed manuscripts in other parts of the world. The Fatimid style favored cases with fitted lids and internal divisions that held individual manuscripts upright, preventing the lateral pressure that damaged bindings and distorted pages over long periods. The cases were labeled. The sources suggest that labels in fluid script identified the subject category of a case's contents and arranged in a sequence that the staff understood and maintained. Moving a manuscript from one section to another, or returning it from a borrowing scholar's hands to its original position, required attention to this sequence, and the maintenance of the sequence was part of what the library's professional staff did continuously and routinely, day after day, in the way that any institution maintaining a large organized collection does work that is unglamorous and essential in equal measure. The collection grew through multiple channels. Acquisition agents, scholars or merchants employed by the Fatimid court, traveled through the Islamic world seeking manuscripts that the library did not yet hold, purchasing them at the book markets that functioned in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Shiraz, and in the other major centers of Arabic scholarly life. Gifts from rulers and scholars added to the holdings, since presenting a rare manuscript to the Fatimid Caliph was a recognized form of diplomatic and scholarly relationship. The library's own scriptorium produced new copies of existing texts, expanding the collection's redundancy, its capacity to survive the loss of a single copy, and also producing copies for distribution to affiliated institutions. Confiscation added to the holdings in ways the sources mention without dwelling on. The libraries of officials who fell from favor, the private collections of scholars who died without heirs, the accumulated books of institutions that ceased to function for one political reason or another. The result, over 2 centuries of Fatimid rule, was a collection whose scope and organization had no equivalent in the world west of its location, and very few equals to its east. The Abbasid tradition in Baghdad had produced something comparable in an earlier period, but Baghdad's intellectual infrastructure had been disrupted by the political and military instability of the 9th and 10th centuries, and the Fatimid library in Cairo had, by the time of al-Hakim's reign, emerged as the largest single collection of manuscripts in the Islamic world, and perhaps in the world overall, organized and maintained by a professional staff in a building that had been built or adapted specifically for its use. The physical fact of this remains, in some important sense, present. The foundations of Al-Qahira are still in the ground beneath Cairo. The Fatimid gates, Bab el-Futuh and Bab el-Nasr, still stand at the northern edge of the old city, their stone exactly as old as the library they once helped to enclose. The lanes between them run in patterns that have not fundamentally changed in 900 years, and the ground beneath the paving stones holds the layered deposit of 10 centuries of occupation in a continuous, uninterrupted stratigraphy. Somewhere within that stratigraphic grass are foundations of the palace complex that housed the library. The exact position of the library's rooms within those foundations has not been determined. The excavation that would answer the question has not been conducted. What the building looked like on an ordinary working day, not a ceremonial occasion, not a moment of political significance, but simply a morning in 1010 CE, when the library was open and functioning, is a question the sources only partially answer. A scholar arriving at the entrance and receiving the free paper available there, a copyist at the scriptorium table, beginning the day's transcription work with the specific physical focus that the task required, the Casino Kutub, moving through the stacks with the lamp, checking the condition of a binding that had been reported as damaged, setting aside a manuscript for recopying before its pages became too fragile to serve as an exemplar, the sound of a reed pen on paper, the smell of carbon ink and leather, and the particular dry warmth of a stone room in a Cairo morning. These sensory details are not in the sources. They have to be assembled from the physical logic of the objects and the spaces, from what manuscripts of the period feel like when held, from what a dry stone room smells like when it holds thousands of objects made of organic material. The assembly is informed. It is not invention. The library's multilingual shelves return as the most vivid image the period offers. Arabic beside Syriac, beside Hebrew, beside Coptic, organized by a system the Casino Kutub maintained, in rooms lit by high narrow windows, tended by professionals whose names are mostly unrecorded and whose work has mostly gone unacknowledged. The specific arrangement of the world's knowledge, all of the world's knowledge that one city in one century could gather and organize, held in a particular building in Al-Qahira, in a form that was meant to last. The building is still there, in the sense that its foundations are still in the ground. The streets above it still carry the same basic geometry. The city around it has grown and changed in 900 years in ways that make it unrecognizable in almost every particular. And underneath the dressed stone of a floor that has not been fully excavated, the question of what the library held and what became of it, and whether any of it remains exactly where it was placed, is still open in the most literal and physical sense available to a question about something buried under a city that has never stopped being a city since the day those particular books were shelved. In the 1060s CE, the Fatimid Palace in Cairo was a place of thick walls and thicker silences. The palace complex occupied the northern quarter of Al-Qahira, the walled royal city, and its interior corridors ran long and cool between rooms that had been filled over 2 generations of Fatimid rule, with the accumulated weight of a dynasty that had made the collection of knowledge a project of state. Somewhere in those corridors, in the particular years when the Fatimid world was beginning to come apart at its edges, manuscript cases were being moved, not displayed, not consulted, not cataloged in the ordinary run of the library's operations, but carried by hands belonging to people whose names the record did not preserve, through stone passages and down stairwells toward places that would not be easy to find. The crisis that set this in motion had a name. Medieval Arabic historiography called it the Shiddat, the Great Tribulation, and it arrived in the 1060s CE as a convergence of forces that the Fatimid state could not absorb without fracturing. The Nile's floods failed in successive years, producing famine conditions across Egypt that the palace's administrative machinery was not designed to manage at such scale. At the same time, the military formations that the Fatimid Caliphate had assembled over decades, Turkish cavalry units, Sudanese infantry regiments, Berber contingents from the Western territories, turned against one another in a prolonged internal conflict that shifted effective control of Cairo back and forth between factions, while the Caliph, increasingly nominal in his authority, remained within the palace walls. What the chroniclers recorded was not a single event, but an extended erosion, the gradual diminishment of a dynasty's capacity to hold the thing it had built. The palace library sat at the center of this. It had been assembled across roughly 2 centuries of Fatimid rule, and by the period of the Shiddat, it represented the most concentrated collection of manuscripts in the Islamic world, perhaps anywhere on earth. What happened to it during these years was not a single decision made by a single person in a moment of crisis, but a process distributed across time, carried out by many hands, with outcomes that no surviving document describes in full. Part of what the record shows is straightforward. Manuscripts were sold, the palace required money to pay soldiers' wages, and the library's holdings were a resource that could be converted. The medieval historian Ibn al-Muyassar and others recorded that significant portions of the collection moved out of the palace in this period, dispersed into the hands of merchants, scholars, private collectors, and buyers whose identities and locations were not tracked. Books left in carts. Cases were carried out through the palace gates that had been built to keep the world at a respectful distance from the caliph's household. The library, that had stood as an institution of deliberate accumulation, became, for a period, an institution of dispersal. What happened to the rest is where the documented record gives way, slowly, to the logic of concealment. A manuscript in motion is a vulnerable object. It can be seized, damaged, destroyed, or simply lost in the confusion of contested spaces and changed hands. The administrators who had worked in the Fatimid library, the keepers of books, the copyists, the subject specialists who had spent careers organizing and tending the collection, would have understood this with the precise clarity of people whose professional lives had been given to the physical care of exactly these objects. A book sold might survive. A book left on an open shelf in a palace whose corridors were now crossed by armed men from competing factions might not. The question of what to do with what remained of the collection after the selling had run its course was not an abstract question about knowledge or history. It was a practical question about objects. Where could these specific physical things be placed, such that they would still exist when the present conditions changed? The answer that appears across several traditions of evidence is below. Islamic historical sources and the physical record of archaeological work in Cairo and elsewhere in the Islamic world document a set of concealment practices that were in use across this period whenever manuscripts needed to be protected from political instability or military pressure. The methods were not improvised. They represented an established knowledge about how a book could be made to endure conditions that were likely to damage or destroy it if it were simply left in place. Manuscripts were wrapped individually in oiled linen, a material that reduced the passage of moisture and provided a layer of physical protection against the abrasion of storage and movement. They were then placed in containers, sealed ceramic jars with their mouths stopped with beeswax and covered in cloth, or wooden chests lined with the same oiled fabric, their lids fitted carefully and sealed along the join with pine resin or a similar material. The choice of container depended on what was available and what scale of concealment was intended. A single valuable manuscript might go into a jar small enough to be carried by one person. A significant portion of a collection required chests, sometimes lead-lined for additional protection against moisture, built to a size that 2 or 3 people could lower into a prepared space and leave without visible trace. The spaces chosen for burial were as deliberate as the wrapping. Dry locations were preferred above all other considerations because moisture was the primary enemy of both paper and leather across any significant span of time. Building foundations offered one option, a niche cut into the stonework of a wall being constructed or reconstructed, the manuscripts placed inside, and the wall finished over them. The surface, once completed, was smooth and unmarked, giving no indication from outside of what the interior held. Cave systems offered another possibility, and the limestone geology of the Cairo region was honeycombed with exactly such spaces, particularly in and below the Muqattam Hills, to the east of the city, where centuries of quarrying had opened cavities both natural and artificial into the rock. The quarry workers and the architects who had used this stone to build Al-Qahira and the older city of Fustat below it knew where the solid limestone ended and the hollow spaces began. That knowledge was not widely published, but it was not secret either. It was the practical working knowledge of the people who had built the city with their hands. There is another possibility that the evidence suggests without confirming directly. The palace complex itself contained, below its public rooms and formal spaces, a network of storage and service areas that had accumulated across the building's history of construction, expansion, and modification. A large institutional building, occupied and continuously altered over 2 centuries, developed spaces that are no longer in active use, rooms that have been sealed off as the function they served became redundant, passages that were closed when a new corridor made them unnecessary. These spaces would have been dry because the palace was built on ground that the Fatimids had chosen specifically for its elevation and drainage. They would have been invisible from the outside. They would have required no construction work to prepare, only the placement of the manuscripts inside, and the sealing of a door that had already been disused long enough that no one with competing interests was paying attention to it. The physical fact of the Cairo Geniza offers the most persuasive demonstration that what is being considered here is genuinely possible. In 1896, a sealed chamber within the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, the older settlement that had grown up south of Al-Qahira, was opened after having been inaccessible for a period that scholars later estimated at approximately 900 years. What the chamber contained was not an organized archive. It was a geniza, a storage repository for discarded texts, maintained by a tradition that prohibited the destruction of documents containing the name of God, and so requiring that any such document be kept rather than thrown away. The result, accumulated across the centuries of the synagogue's use, was a room thick with paper fragments, documents, letters, legal records, literary texts, and discarded manuscript pages, all preserved by a combination of deliberate containment and the specific environmental conditions of the Cairo region. The air was dry, the chamber was sealed, the paper survived. The Cairo Geniza demonstrated several things simultaneously. It demonstrated that the climate of Cairo, low humidity, stable temperature, the particular dryness of a built environment set into limestone and ancient urban deposit, was genuinely capable of preserving paper and parchment across the span of many centuries without any specialized intervention beyond enclosure. It demonstrated that sealed chambers in buildings of continuous occupation could remain undisturbed for very long periods, not because anyone was guarding them, but simply because a sealed room in an active building accumulates no reason to be opened. It demonstrated that the documentary record of the medieval Islamic world and of the Jewish community that had existed within and alongside that world was not entirely gone, that significant material survived in exactly the kind of ordinary, accidental, unremarkable concealment that required no conspiracy and no particular drama to produce. The relevance of all this to the Fatimid Palace Library is not that the library was hidden like a geniza. The geniza was a repository for text no longer in active use, accumulated gradually, over centuries, by a community observing a religious obligation. The Fatimid library, if any part of it was concealed in the Shaddad period, would have been hidden deliberately, quickly, in a moment of political and military pressure, by people who understood exactly what they were protecting and why. These are different acts with different motivations and different methods. What the Geniza confirms is the environmental premise. The ground beneath Old Cairo is capable of holding paper in a legible condition across the full span of time, from the Fatimid period to the present. The question is not whether such preservation is physically possible. The evidence of 1896 settled that question beyond dispute. The geography of the search, such as it has been, tends to concentrate in two areas. The Muqattam Hills, to the east of Old Cairo, carry a persistent tradition of association with concealment that runs across several independent lines of evidence, not all of them reliable, and not all of them equally weighed by those who have studied the question carefully. The hills were the site of the limestone quarries that had supplied the building material for Al-Qahira and for the older Arab city of Fustat before it. They were also the site of Al-Hakim's solitary nocturnal rides and his final disappearance, which gave them an established association with the Fatimid dynasty in the popular imagination of Cairo for centuries afterward. Cave systems in the limestone are documented in the hills and their immediate approaches. Whether any of these specific cavities were used for manuscript storage in the Shaddad period is a question the available evidence does not answer directly. The area of Fustat presents a different kind of argument. The older settlement, which had been continuously occupied since the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, had accumulated by the 11th century a depth of urban deposit that represented layer upon layer of construction, demolition, and rebuilding on the same ground. The particular section of Fustat nearest to the surviving Ben Ezra synagogue had been substantially burned and rebuilt in the upheavals of the later 11th century, which meant that buildings from the Fatimid period were buried under the remains of later construction rather than standing exposed. The Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale, the French archaeological institution that had conducted significant work in Egypt since the 19th century, and the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt had both worked in sections of this area, but the excavations that had taken place were fragmentary in their coverage and limited by the density of the living city above. What had been examined represented a small portion of the total deposit. What remained beneath the surface had simply not been reached. The Fatimid Palace area itself, the northern quarter of the old city, presented the most significant and the most intractable problem of all three locations. The palace complex no longer existed as a standing structure. It had been demolished gradually after the Fatimid Caliphate's end in 1171 CE, its materials reused in later construction, its footprint absorbed into the medieval urban fabric of Cairo, which had continued to build and rebuild on the same ground across the subsequent 9 centuries. The streets of the old city ran, in their basic geometry, along lines that preserved something of the Fatimid period's organization. The gates of Bab al-Futu and Bab al-Nasr, built in 1087 CE, still stood at the northern edge of the former palace zone, their masonry intact, their positions unchanged, but what lay below the present street level was a compressed stratigraphy of 9 centuries of continuous urban occupation under paving stones and building foundations that had themselves been built over and built over again. The palace's substructure, if any of it survived, was below all of that. It had never been excavated in any comprehensive way. The density of the living city above it made any such excavation a project of extraordinary logistical complexity, requiring the cooperation of residents, property owners, municipal authorities, and multiple overlapping institutional frameworks for the management of Egypt's archaeological heritage. No such project had been organized. The question of what lay beneath the dressed stone floors of Al-Qahira remained in the most strictly literal sense unanswered. There is a figure that moves through the story of the concealment who has no name in the surviving record. Not a fictional figure, not a mythologized one, but a person whose existence the logic of the historical situation makes essentially certain, the palace official or the senior library administrator, who understood in the Shaddad period what was happening to the collection and made decisions about what to do with the portion that had not yet been sold. Someone had to carry out whatever concealment took place. The manuscripts did not move themselves. The containers did not seal themselves. The spaces in the walls or the floors or the hillside did not prepare themselves for occupation. A human being, or a small group of human beings, did the physical work of placing the manuscripts in their wrappings, fitting them into their containers, carrying those containers to wherever they were placed, and sealing the openings behind them. These people would have had specific knowledge of the palace's substructure, of the limestone geology east of the city, of the techniques that would best preserve paper across an uncertain span of time, that was not available to everyone, but that was available to the people whose professional lives had been spent in the care of this specific collection. The folkloric tradition that attaches itself to this figure, present in several versions of the buried library, story across different sources and different periods holds that those who carried out the concealment met with ends that prevented them from returning. In some versions, the ending is execution, carried out in the political chaos of the regime's collapse by one of the military factions that had effectively taken control of Cairo. In other versions, it is simply disappearance, the same fate that had claimed al-Hakim himself 4 decades earlier, a vanishing into circumstances that the record could not recover or chose not to record. This motif of the person who knows too much, who carries out the act of concealment and then ceases to appear in the sources, is not specific to the Fatimid library story. It appears in similar form in the accounts of other political collapses and other moments of emergency preservation across the Islamic historical record. As a folkloric pattern, it reflects a real structural feature of regime collapse. Court officials, palace administrators, and the holders of institutional knowledge frequently did disappear during such moments, executed as politically inconvenient by incoming powers, killed in the violence of contested transitions, or simply absorbed into the undifferentiated mass of people who ceased to be documented because no subsequent authority had a reason to document them. Whether the specific people who may have hidden the Fatimid manuscripts met such ends is not established by any document. The distinction between what is documented and what the tradition has supplied to fill the silence is real and worth maintaining. What is documented is that the Fatimid palace administration lost coherence in the Shaddad period. What is documented is that manuscripts left the palace during those years by sale and possibly by concealment. What is documented is that when the Ayyubid dynasty under Saladin formally ended the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171 CE and converted Egypt back to Sunni Islam, the process of institutional erasure that followed was deliberate and thorough. Records were destroyed. The Ismaili Shia intellectual tradition was severed from Egypt's official memory, and the physical library that had been the Dar al-Ilm fell into a state that the sources describe, with varying degrees of specificity, none of them satisfactory. What happened to the people who had tended the collection in the Shaddad period and in the decades between that crisis and the Ayyubid takeover is a question the record holds in silence without commenting on the silence. The physical process of concealment, when it is imagined in the specific terms the evidence supports, has a quality of patient, careful work rather than frantic emergency. The oiled linen that wrapped the manuscripts had to be cut to size. Each individual manuscript was wrapped separately, with attention to the binding and the edges, the parts most vulnerable to damage. The containers had to be prepared, the ceramic jars checked for cracks, the wooden chests fitted with their lining, the resin or wax prepared for sealing. The manuscripts were stacked inside with the consideration of someone who understood the physical properties of paper and leather and the mechanics of how pressure and moisture would act on them over time. This was skilled work carried out by people with specific expertise. It was not the work of panic. It was the work of people who had spent years or decades handling exactly these objects in exactly this way, and who now applied the same professional care to an act of preservation that was intended not for immediate use, but for a future that neither they nor anyone else could specify. A cedar chest sits, in the imagination of the evidence, in a prepared space somewhere beneath the old city. Its interior is lined with oiled linen. The manuscripts inside are wrapped individually, their bindings held firm against the smooth fabric, their pages sealed from the air by the careful joining of the lid above them. The lid is fitted. The seam is sealed with pine resin, applied in a careful bead around the join, smoothed by a finger or a small tool, left to harden. The chest is placed into its niche, cut into the stone of a wall, or lowered into a cavity in a floor, or set into a space in the foundation of a structure that was in the process of being rebuilt. The opening is closed over it. Stone is laid, or mortar is spread, or a door is sealed. And then above this sealed space, the work of the day continues, and the city continues, and the decades accumulate, and the dynasty that made the library ends, and the city changes hands, and the faith of the city changes, and new buildings rise above the old foundations, and new streets are laid over the old ones, and new generations walk above what is below, without any particular knowledge of what is below, and the chest continues to hold its contents in the specific patient darkness of a sealed room. What a ceramic jar of the Fatimid period looks like in the archaeological record is documented by the objects that have been recovered from comparable contexts elsewhere in the Islamic world. They are typically undecorated, functional in their proportions, made of a fired clay that was designed for storage rather than display. The mouth of such a jar is narrow enough to be stopped with a plug of beeswax. The beeswax pressed in and smoothed, then covered with cloth tied around the neck of the jar with a length of cord or leather. In dry conditions, both the wax and the cloth survive the passage of centuries without significant deterioration. The contents of a jar sealed in this way in the climate of the Cairo region would not be exposed to the moisture or the temperature fluctuation that breaks down paper and leather. The jar itself, sitting on the floor of a sealed cavity in the limestone or the compressed urban deposit of Fustat, would not be exposed to the pressure or the chemical processes that cause ceramic to fracture. Such an object, placed in such conditions in the 11th century, could in principle be sitting in precisely the same state in the 21st, waiting for the moment when the stone above it was opened and a light was introduced into the space it had occupied without interruption for 900 years. The excavation of the Fatimid Palace area is not a project that has been abandoned or indefinitely postponed as a matter of institutional decision. It is a project that has not been fully organized because the conditions that would be required to carry it out, the clearing of the existing urban fabric above the relevant sections of the palace footprint, the coordination of the multiple authorities with jurisdiction over the area, the sustained funding and institutional commitment for a project whose duration would be measured in decades, have not yet been assembled in one place at one time. The fragmentary work that has been done represents the portion of the task that was possible within existing constraints. The portion that has not been done represents not a conclusion but a deferral, the question still standing in the ground, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to be answered. The streets above the palace's former footprint are quiet at certain hours. The medieval gates of Bab al-Futuh and Bab al-Nasr stand in the northern wall of the old city, their stone weathered to the particular pale color that Cairo's limestone takes on after many centuries in the dry air. The lanes between them run in the geometry they have held for 900 years, their paving worn smooth by continuous use, the buildings along them altered and rebuilt, and altered again within a framework of streets that does not much change. Below the paving stones, below the foundations of the buildings that line the lanes, below the accumulated deposit of 9 centuries of urban occupation, the Fatimid Palace's substructure, whatever remains of it, sits in the darkness that has been its condition since the last time a lamp was carried into those lower spaces, and the door was sealed behind the person who carried it. The dressed stone floor of a foundation cavity, when it has been undisturbed for 9 centuries, bears no marks that distinguish it from any other dressed stone floor, and Its surface is smooth in the way that all such surfaces become smooth, worn by the particular friction of nothing, polished by the absence of contact, carrying no sign of what is on the other side. A person walking above it, if such a thing were possible, would feel nothing different under their feet. The stone gives no indication. The sealed space below it does not announce itself. It simply continues to be there in the specific and particular silence of a room that has not been entered, holding whatever was placed inside it in the last moment before the door was closed and the surface was finished. Over it and the world above continued on its way, not knowing what the ground was holding, not asking. The excavation of the Fatimid Palace area has never been completed. That is a fact, fully documented in the record of what has and has not been done. What is below the dressed stone floors of Al-Qahira has not yet been seen. That is also a fact, in the most literal and straightforward archaeological sense. The question of whether a cedar chest or a ceramic jar or a sealed stone niche sits beneath those floors, containing manuscripts wrapped in oiled linen that have not been disturbed since the 1060s CE, is a question the ground holds without comment. The city above it continues in the ordinary business of its days. The sealed foundation cavity, if it exists, continues in the ordinary condition of sealed things, intact, undisturbed, patient, dark. In Baghdad, in the year 987 CE, a bookseller named Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn al-Nadim set down his pen and considered what he had made. The object before him was not a book in the ordinary sense. It was a catalog, an annotated list of every text available in the Arabic reading world that he had been able to locate, verify, describe, and record. He called it the Fihrist, which means simply the index or the list. It ran to thousands of entries organized by subject and author, each entry carrying not just a title, but a brief account of the text's contents, its author's life, the debates it had provoked, and in some cases the specific shops in Baghdad where a copy could be acquired. Nothing like it had been attempted before. Nothing like it would be attempted again for centuries. And sitting with it now, turning its pages in the mind, what becomes apparent is something the catalog's author may not have fully intended to document: the shape of what was already, even in 987 CE, beginning to disappear. The gaps in the Fihrist are not empty spaces on the page. Ibn al-Nadim does not leave blank lines where he cannot find a text. The absences are more subtle than that, and more telling. A work is cited by another author as existing and being of great importance. Ibn al-Nadim records the citation. He records the work's title and its subject. He records what others have said about it. But no copy appears in the Baghdad market. No bookseller has seen it. No student has transcribed it. The entry stands in the catalog like a room whose door no one can locate, described by those who visited it years ago, present in the record, but not presently accessible to any hand that might reach for it. Scholars of Islamic intellectual history who have spent careers cross-referencing the Fihrist against the catalogs of surviving manuscript collections note that this pattern appears consistently across certain categories of text: philosophical works of a particular tradition, astronomical treatises attributed to scholars who worked under specific patronages, medical texts associated with libraries that later changed hands. The entries are there, the books are not. Ibn al-Nadam worked from a shop in the Souq al-Lakin, the bookseller's market of Baghdad, which occupied a district of open-fronted stalls along the western bank of the Tigris. Medieval travelers who described it wrote of manuscript pages drying on lines strung between awnings. the smell of fresh ink and dressed leather rising together in the market air, scholars moving along the rows with written lists of texts they were seeking and lists of texts they were offering in exchange. The trade was organized, professional, and very old. Books were commodities with assessed values. Copyists were skilled tradespeople who commanded specific rates per page, depending on the script and subject matter. And the relationship between the court libraries and the commercial market was continuous. Royal collections purchased from the market and texts that circulated through court hands eventually re-entered commerce through copying, gift, or deliberate sale. The Suk al-Warakon was, among other things, a living index of what the civilization had written down and what it was still willing to read. When a text stopped appearing there, it meant something. The institution that stood behind that market, that had done more than any other single structure to create the conditions for its existence, was the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in the same city of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur had established a translation office there in the 8th century, but it was under the Caliph al-Mamun, who reigned from 813 to 833 CE, that the institution reached the scale for which history remembers it. Al-Mamun sent agents to Constantinople and to the monasteries of Syria to acquire Greek manuscripts. He corresponded with the rulers of India and Persia to obtain texts on mathematics and astronomy. He offered translators rates of payment that, by the accounts of the period, amounted to the weight of a translated manuscript in gold. The result was the Arabic translation movement, the systematic rendering into Arabic of the philosophical, scientific, and medical texts of ancient Greece, of Sasanian Persia, of Sanskrit India. Scholars of intellectual history treat this process as among the most consequential acts of textual transfer in the history of world civilization. The work of Aristotle, of Ptolemy, of Galen, of Euclid passed through the House of Wisdom and into Arabic, and through Arabic, centuries later, back into Latin, back into Europe, arriving in the libraries of medieval universities in a form that bore the marks of every hand that had carried it across the intervening centuries. Al-Mamun's House of Wisdom was not only a library, though it held an enormous one. It was also an observatory, a translation office, and a gathering place for scholars working across every discipline the court recognized as legitimate. The astronomers who worked there produced zig tables, observational almanacs of planetary positions that would remain in use for centuries after the institution itself had changed. The mathematicians who worked there developed the algebra that still carries an Arabic name. The translators who worked there did not simply render Greek into Arabic and stop. They annotated, they debated, they added commentaries that became as significant as the texts they accompanied. The collection that accumulated over decades of this work was not merely large. It was organized, cataloged, and in the care of a professional staff whose specific responsibilities were understood and recorded. The Khazin al-Kutub, the keeper of books, in a major Abbasid institution of this kind, held a position that carried genuine scholarly authority. Several individuals who held the title at Baghdad and at comparable courts went on to become advisors, viziers, or significant intellectual figures in their own right. Access to the inner rooms of a court library was not automatic or universal. Not every text on every shelf was equally available to every reader who arrived at the door. The librarian controlled that gradation, and the key to the locked inner room was in the accounts that survive, sometimes kept literally on a cord around the librarian's neck. The Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba watched what Baghdad had built and built its own version with the same seriousness and considerably more personal investment. The Caliph al-Hakam II, who reigned from 961 to 976 CE on the Iberian Peninsula, maintained a library whose holdings were reported to have reached 400,000 volumes, a figure that places it in the same order of magnitude as the largest contemporary claims for collections in Baghdad and later Cairo. What distinguishes al-Hakam's library in the accounts is not only the number of texts, but the quality of the acquisition. Al-Hakam employed agents across the Islamic world with a specific and documented brief to acquire desirable manuscripts before they arrived in the Baghdad market. He corresponded directly with authors in the Eastern Caliphate, requesting presentation copies of works before general circulation had begun. When a new text was completed by a scholar of significance, al-Hakam's agents were, if the sources are to be trusted, among the first buyers. The catalog of his personal collection, a bibliographic record he maintained as a scholarly project in its own right, ran to 44 volumes of description alone. The catalog of the catalog, as it were, was itself a significant work of reference literature. That catalog has not survived entire. The library in Córdoba occupied a wing of the great palace complex of Medina Azahara, outside the city on the slopes above the Guadalquivir plain. Accounts of the room describe long windows looking out toward the river and the low agricultural plain beyond it, the shelves organized by subject, the room lit by an arrangement of windows and interior lamps calibrated for the comfort of extended reading. Al-Hakam himself was a working scholar as well as a patron. Annotations in his own hand have been identified in manuscripts that survive from this period, notes in the margins of philosophical texts, marks indicating passages he wished to return to, brief personal commentaries in the spaces between lines. The image the sources produce is not of a monarch collecting books as emblems of status, but of a reader who happened to have the resources and the political position to assemble, around his personal practice of reading, the largest private library in the Western Islamic world. What happened to it after al-Hakam's death in 976 CE is a matter of dispersal rather than sudden destruction. His successor, under the influence of advisors who found the library's philosophical holdings ideologically inconvenient, ordered portions of the collection removed and destroyed. The process was documented by contemporaries who described it with a kind of controlled distress. The specific works named as targeted were those of Greek philosophy and logic, the texts that later centuries would identify as having passed from the House of Wisdom into the Córdoba collection, and from there, eventually, into European scholasticism. The loss of the House of Wisdom itself came later, and it came in a single event that the written record of the Islamic world treats as a fixed point of rupture. In 1258 CE, the Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan crossed into Mesopotamia and took Baghdad after a siege. The accounts written in the decades following describe the Tigris running dark with ink from manuscripts thrown into the river, a detail that has passed into the general historical imagination as an image of deliberate cultural destruction. Modern historians approach that image with precision. The actual damage to Baghdad's manuscript culture in 1258, while severe, was less complete than the iconic account suggests. The House of Wisdom had not been a single static institution, holding a single static collection since the time of Al-Mamun. Over the 4 centuries between its founding and the Mongol conquest, the collection had been copied, distributed, cited, excerpted, and in many cases physically moved to other libraries across the Islamic world. No single military event, however devastating, could have destroyed every copy of every text that had passed through the institution's walls. What the sack of Baghdad ended was the institutional life, the ongoing project of acquisition, translation, commentary, and preservation that had given the collection its intellectual character. The building and the administrative structure were gone. The manuscript culture those structures had sustained was damaged, dispersed, and disrupted, but not in the account that survives, entirely eliminated. The question the Firist makes visible, where did the texts go, that are listed but not held, cannot be answered by any single event. The gaps in the surviving record reflect centuries of processes: fire, flood, the ordinary decay of organic materials left without care, the deliberate removal of texts considered politically or theologically problematic by successive ruling powers, and the concealment of collections by those who wish to protect them from exactly these fates. The Islamic scholarly tradition had, by the 10th century, a well-developed understanding of the risks a library faced, and a correspondingly developed practice of protective dispersal. A scholar who held a significant private collection did not keep all of it in one location. A court library that sensed political instability might begin distributing copies of its most important texts to affiliated institutions in other cities. The very network of libraries that made the Arabic reading world intellectually coherent, Cordoba and Baghdad, and Cairo and Nishapur and Samarkand, all holding versions of the same core texts, each holding some texts the others did not, was also a network that provided the collection with a kind of distributed resilience. The destruction of one node did not necessarily destroy the text. It destroyed a copy, sometimes the oldest or most accurate copy, but not the only copy. The pattern this creates in the historical record is one that manuscript historians have spent careers learning to read. A text that disappears from the Cairo market after a specific political event might re-emerge in a library inventory in Yemen a century later. A work that is not listed in any surviving Abbasid catalog might appear once in a marginal citation in a Persian commentary of the 12th century, a citation that suggests the commenter had access to a copy no other scholar appears to have seen. The bibliographic literature of the medieval Islamic world is full of these traces. Texts cited by scholars who clearly had them in hand, texts described by bibliographers who had heard of them from reliable sources, texts whose existence is attested by the responses they generated in other works, even when the original text itself cannot be located. This shadow literature, present as reference, absent as object, is the material that researchers in Islamic manuscript studies still work with, still attempt to locate, still trace through the secondary record, in the hope that a citation will eventually lead to a physical object on a shelf somewhere in a collection that has not yet been fully cataloged. The court library in this world was never simply a building, it was an argument. The Islamic royal patron who built and stocked a major library was making a claim about legitimacy, about the relationship between political authority and divine knowledge, about the particular character of the civilization over which that patron ruled. Al-Mamun's decision to fund the translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic was not only an intellectual project, it was a statement about the kind of caliph he was and the kind of caliphate he led. Al-Hakam's obsessive acquisition of texts from across the Islamic world was not only personal bookishness, it was a performance of Cordoba's claim to cultural precedence over Baghdad, a demonstration that the Western Caliphate was the legitimate center of Islamic intellectual life. The Fatimid dynasty's collection in Cairo, with its reported millions of volumes and its stated commitment to making knowledge publicly available, was similarly a political act, an argument for the Fatimid Caliphate's particular vision of how a Muslim ruler should relate to learning, to the communities under his rule, and to the full range of human inquiry. When these libraries changed hands or disappeared, what was lost was not only the manuscripts. What was lost, or in some cases deliberately severed, was the institutional memory of how those manuscripts had been acquired, organized, and used. The accumulated expertise of the librarians and copyists and subject scholars who had made those collections into intellectual tools rather than mere accumulations of objects. The Khazin al-Kutub of a major Abbasid or Fatimid library was not a passive custodian, and the position required sufficient scholarly credentials to function as an intellectual interlocutor for the ruler, to advise on acquisitions, to navigate the organization of a collection so large that no single person could hold its full inventory in mind, and to manage the graduated access that a royal collection required. The inner rooms of a major Islamic court library held texts that were not available to general readers, works considered politically sensitive, or esoteric, or in a stage of preparation that did not yet make them suitable for wide circulation. The librarian's key to those rooms was a practical object and a symbol simultaneously, and several biographical accounts of major Islamic scholars mention in passing having been granted access to a restricted portion of a court library by a librarian who had judged the scholar's preparation and credentials sufficient. This suggests a system that was both carefully organized and genuinely functional, not a symbolic arrangement, but a working institution with a staff that understood what it held and why certain portions of it required careful management. The question of what texts were held in those inner rooms and what happened to them when the institution that housed them collapsed runs through the Fibrces gaps like a thread that cannot quite be grasped. Ibn al-Nadim knew that his catalog was not complete. He knew that significant texts existed, of which he had only partial knowledge. He noted in several entries that a work was known to him only through citation, that he had not personally seen a copy, that the work appeared to have circulated briefly before disappearing from the market. Writing in 987 CE, working from a shop in the bookseller's quarter of the largest city in the Islamic world, with access to the most active manuscript trade in the history of the civilization, to that point, he could still see the gaps. He documented them not as failures, but as items still to be resolved, a list that was by its own logic permanently incomplete because the material it was attempting to index was always in motion, always changing hands, always subject to the processes that moved manuscripts out of circulation, and occasionally, unpredictably, back in. The world that produced the Fiderist and the collections it cataloged was larger and more diverse in its manuscript culture than any single library within it. The Suq al-Waraqah of Baghdad was one market in a network of markets that extended from Cordoba to Nishapur, from Cairo to Samarkand, from the commercial ports of the Indian Ocean trade to the libraries of Constantinople, Gambelt to Nishapur, from Cairo to the Sambultigradfur, but know where Greek manuscripts were still held in Byzantine collections that the Arabic translation movement had accessed and would continue to access for centuries. A text that fell out of the Baghdad market might re-enter the record in Cordoba. A work that was known in Cairo might be unknown in Nishapur until a traveling scholar carried a copy eastward. The movement of manuscripts across this network was continuous, largely undocumented, and governed by the same logic that governed the movement of any other durable commodity across long trade routes: opportunity, price, political access, and the specific interests of the buyers and sellers who happened to encounter each other at a given moment. This mobility was also a form of vulnerability. A text that existed in only one copy, in a single location, was one event away from disappearing. The institution of scholarly travel in the medieval Islamic world, the rihla, the journey undertaken specifically to find and study manuscripts not available at home, was partly a response to this vulnerability. A practice of seeking out texts before the location where they were held became inaccessible. Scholars who undertook these journeys described them in terms that modern manuscript researchers would recognize. The experience of arriving at a library and finding it in better or worse condition than reported, of discovering a text one had been seeking for years, of being denied access to a portion of the collection by a librarian who found the request insufficiently authorized. The accounts are specific and practical. They are not romantic accounts of intellectual adventure. They are the working records of a scholarly culture that understood, from direct experience, how easily knowledge could become inaccessible through the closure of a court, the death of a collector, the disruption of a political arrangement, or simply the absence of anyone willing to pay the copyist's rate for a text that had temporarily fallen out of fashion. What those scholars could not document, because they had no way of knowing it, was the extent to which the network they traveled was already beginning to contract. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE is the most visible point of rupture in the medieval Islamic manuscript record, but it was not the only one, and it was not the first. The political collapse of the Cordoba Caliphate in the early 11th century dispersed the library of Al-Hakam, two across Iberia and North Africa, without any organized plan of preservation. The destruction and reconstruction of library collections during the political turbulence of the Fatimid period created gaps in the Cairo record that preceded the Ayyubid conversion by more than a century. The Crusader period disrupted manuscript circulation through the Levant in ways that are difficult to assess because the records on both sides of the disruption are incomplete. Each of these events contributed to the cumulative pattern that the figurist makes visible, the accumulating gap between what the civilization had written and what the civilization could still read. The surviving manuscripts from this world are held now in collections distributed across the same geographical range as the civilization that produced them, and in some places beyond it. The Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul holds hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, many of them acquired during the Ottoman period from libraries and collections throughout the former Abbasid and Fatimid territories. The British Library in London holds significant Islamic manuscript holdings acquired through the colonial and post-colonial periods. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France holds collections assembled by agents of the French state over centuries of diplomatic and scholarly contact with the Islamic world. In Cairo itself, the Dar al-Kutub, the Egyptian National Library, holds collections assembled since the 19th century, including fragments and partial manuscripts whose complete versions have never been located. Each of these institutions holds texts that, from the perspective of the Fihrist's gaps, represent recovered knowledge, texts that were, at some point between the 10th century and now, in danger of not surviving at all, and that survived because someone somewhere made a copy or carried an original or stored a manuscript in conditions dry and stable enough to allow it to persist. A page from the Fihrist, examined now in one of the surviving manuscript copies, has a particular quality to it. The handwriting is small and practiced, filling every available line with bibliographic notation, title, author, a brief account of the work's content, occasionally a note about where the author worked or under whose patronage. The entries follow one another without break, organized by the logic of the catalog rather than by any external drama. There is no announcement when the entries shift from texts that any scholar of the period could consult to texts that were already, in 987 CE, becoming difficult to find. The catalog makes no distinction between the available and the vanishing. It records both in the same hand, with the same care, as if the act of writing down the title were itself a form of preservation, a last resort, when the physical object was no longer accessible, a record of the fact that the text had existed even if the text itself could no longer be produced. This was not an unreasonable strategy. The citation record of the medieval Islamic world has, in fact, led modern scholars to manuscripts that would not otherwise have been sought. A text mentioned once in a margin note in a 12th century commentary, identified, traced, and eventually located in a collection cataloged in a different language in a library on a different continent, represents exactly the kind of recovery that Ibn al-Nadim's habit of recording what he could not verify made possible. The condition of the surviving manuscript record is, from this perspective, a testament to the persistence of a professional class: the copyists, the binders, the librarians, the traveling scholars, the court officials who carried manuscripts when they fled, whose work is almost entirely anonymous, the Khazin al-Kutub, whose name does not appear in any surviving source, the Warraq, whose colophon notation identifies only a date and a city, the scholar who carried a single manuscript from Baghdad to Samarkand in 1258 because it was the one copy he had time to take. These figures made the transmission possible without leaving individual records of their choices. The manuscripts that survive represent the accumulated effect of thousands of individual decisions about what was worth carrying, worth copying, worth storing in a dry place, worth hiding in a wall. Each of those decisions was made by a person whose name is not recorded, in a moment whose full circumstances are not known, for reasons that can only be inferred from the fact of the manuscript's survival. The library system of the medieval Islamic world was not only an institutional structure, it was also the sum of all those choices, and the surviving record is the portion of the sum that came through. The Fihrist's gaps, then, are not simply evidence of loss. They are also evidence of the limits of any single document's reach, however comprehensive the document's ambition. Ibn al-Nadim worked from one city with access to one market, consulting sources that were available to him and not to scholars working in other places. The gaps in his catalog reflect Baghdad's particular perspective on the manuscript world of 987 CE. What was visible from that vantage point and what was not. A catalog compiled simultaneously from Cordoba would have different gaps and different entries. A catalog compiled from Cairo would have recorded text the Baghdad market had never seen and missed texts that were common in the Eastern trade. The global shape of what was written, what was copied, and what was held in this period cannot be reconstructed from any single instrument. What the Fihrist gives is a particular and invaluable view, the most comprehensive single survey that survives of the Arabic reading world's written record at a specific moment in its history, and the gaps in that view are exactly as informative as the entries because they show where the view ended and what lay in the territory it could not reach. Sitting with the Fihrist in this way, following its entries through the subjects it organizes, pausing at the entries where the text is described but the copy unlocated, noting the places where the catalog's systematic confidence gives way to the quieter register of "I have heard" that this exists. There is a particular quality of attention that the document rewards. It is not the attention of a researcher building toward a conclusion. It is the attention of someone sitting with an old inventory in a quiet room, reading the names of things that may still exist somewhere, in the care of people who do not yet know they have them, or in the dark of an unexcavated space beneath a city that has been occupied continuously for 1,000 years, its foundations undisturbed, its contents unknown. The libraries of the medieval Islamic world left traces in the manuscript record, in the bibliographic tradition, and in the physical residue of the civilizations that built them. The House of Wisdom left the translations that passed through it into every subsequent century of Islamic and European intellectual life. The Library of Al-Hakam left the dispersed fragments that ended up in the collections of Fez and Marrakesh, and eventually in the hands of scholars who identified them only from the annotations in their margins. The Fatimid Library left the citations, the ghost entries, and the foundations beneath Al-Qahira that no comprehensive excavation has yet reached. And the Fihrist left its list, the titles recorded as existing, the texts no surviving library presently holds, the entries that stand as open inventory items on a catalog that has technically never been closed. The bookseller's market of Baghdad, where Ibn al-Nadim worked, is long gone. The Tigris that flowed past it is still there. The city that grew over the site of the Abbasid capital is among the most continuously inhabited urban places in human history. Its layers of occupation beginning before the Islamic period and running through the medieval and Ottoman eras without interruption to the present day. What lies beneath the surface of that city, in the foundations of structures that rose and fell over 14 centuries, is not known in its entirety. The manuscript culture that the House of Wisdom created was distributed across a network too wide to have been destroyed by any single event, and that network's reach extended into every region of the Islamic world, including Cairo, including the libraries that the Fatimid dynasty built there, including the palace foundations that have not yet been excavated, and the collections that may or may not still rest in them, in the darkness below the city's ordinary surface, patient in a way that only buried things can be, still holding whatever they were given to hold in the year they were sealed. The Feist sits in its surviving copies in libraries in Istanbul and Berlin and London and Cairo. Its entries do not change. The titles it records are the same titles they have always been. And the gaps, the works recorded as existing, the copies that no library presently holds, the items on the list that have not yet been checked off, those gaps remain exactly where they were in 987 CE, open and unhurried, the shape of an inventory that is still, in the most precise sense, waiting to be completed. In a reading room in London, on an ordinary working afternoon, a researcher sits with a manuscript that arrived recently from a collection in Yemen, its pages a deep cream, slightly warped at one edge from some episode of moisture centuries ago, the ink still clear in the dry lines of its Naskh script. The researcher photographs the page under raking light, the lamp angled low across the surface so that the texture of the paper becomes visible, the faint grid of the mold it was formed in, the slight depression where a pen pressed harder on a downstroke. And in that photograph, just visible beneath the written text, there is something else, an earlier text, imperfectly erased. Letters that do not belong to the visible manuscript, running at a slight angle to the lines above them, suggesting that the page was scraped clean and reused, that something was written here first and then removed, replaced with what now appears on the surface, and that the original writing did not entirely agree to disappear. The researcher does not know yet what the earlier text says. The imaging will take time. The comparison with known Fatimid period scripts will take more time. What the researcher holds in this moment is a question in physical form. A page that carries two different moments of writing, one visible and one surviving, only as the ghost of pressure on paper, and the possibility that the hidden text belongs to a tradition whose central institution has not been seen or verified in nearly 1,000 years. This is the current state of the search. Not a dramatic discovery, not a sealed room blown open by some fortunate excavation. A researcher, a lamp, a manuscript, and something faintly legible beneath what was written on top of it. The Institute of Ismaili Studies in London was founded in 1977, and its work in recovering Fatimid period intellectual material has been conducted with the patient methodology that this kind of scholarship requires. The texts it has identified, manuscripts recovered from Yemen, from Iran, from the Bohra community in India, from holdings in East Africa, represent a portion of the Fatimid intellectual tradition that circulated in the world, moved by traders and scholars and missionaries through the networks that connected the medieval Islamic world across enormous distances. Some of these texts were known only as titles. Some were known only as citations in the works of other authors who had read them and noted what they said. The manuscripts themselves, the physical objects, had not been located in any collection, had not been described by any librarian, had simply been absent from the record for centuries. And then, in a private collection in a Yemeni town or in a community archive in Gujarat, a copy would appear, damaged at one edge, lacking the final pages, but legible in its substance, recognizable from the description a 10th century scholar had left behind. Scholars working in Fatimid intellectual history have a name for a particular category of source material. Ghost citations, the term belongs to the working vocabulary of manuscript historians, are instances in later Islamic biographical and bibliographic literature where a writer cites a text, names its author, describes its argument, and sometimes quotes it at length, from a source that cannot be matched to any surviving manuscript. The citation is real. The author named in it was real. The text was real enough that someone read it and wrote about it and considered it worth preserving in summary. But no copy of the text itself has been found in any library in the world, in any catalog of any collection, in any inventory of any institution. The text exists in the record as a presence shaped entirely by the space around it, known through what other writers said about it, visible only in the outline left by its absence. Paul Walker and others working in this area of scholarship have identified a pattern in which ghost citations cluster, particularly around the Fatimid intellectual tradition, around the period of the dynasty's peak institutional output, the late 10th and early 11th centuries, when the Royal Library in Cairo was receiving manuscripts at a rate that no other institution in the Islamic world could match. The clustering is not proof of anything. A text can disappear from the record for reasons that have nothing to do with deliberate concealment, a single copy destroyed in a fire, a collection that simply dispersed into private hands and was never cataloged. But the pattern is there in the bibliographic literature, and it is the kind of pattern that makes a careful researcher pause and look again at the shape of the gaps rather than simply accepting them as ordinary losses. A manuscript that has never been found is not the same as a manuscript that does not exist. This distinction seems elementary, and it is also the one that the entire practice of manuscript recovery rests on. The digital tools now available for this kind of work have changed the character of the search in ways that would have been difficult to anticipate even 30 years ago. The Qatar Digital Library has been engaged in digitizing Islamic manuscripts held in the British Library, documents acquired over centuries through purchase, donation, diplomatic exchange, and the ordinary dispersal of great collections through death and debt, and placing high-resolution images of those manuscripts into a searchable, publicly accessible database. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota operates the VHMML platform. which indexes manuscript holdings from across the world, including collections in Ethiopia, Lebanon, Malta, and the Indian subcontinent, allowing a researcher in one country to search descriptions of manuscripts held in archives they may never visit in person. The Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation has been conducting its own manuscript indexing work, building the comparative catalogs that make it possible to identify when a newly surfaced text matches a ghost citation in the bibliographic record. What these projects are collectively assembling is something that the medieval world had in analog form only once, in the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, the bibliographer of Baghdad, who in 987 CE wrote down the titles and authors and subjects of virtually everything the Arabic reading world had committed to paper, in a catalog whose gaps are themselves a kind of map of what did not survive his time. The digital equivalent is broader, more cross-referenceable, and updated continuously as new collections are described and new manuscripts are imaged. If a text from the Fatimid Royal Library were to surface in a private collection, in an unexcavated deposit, in the hands of a community that has held it for generations without knowing what the wider scholarly world had lost, the database that would allow it to be identified and authenticated now exists in a form that it did not exist a decade ago. The discovery, if it came, would not be recognized only by a handful of specialists who happen to have read the right catalogs. It would be recognizable, matchable against the record, confirmable in its significance. The search has its modern analogs in places far from Cairo. In 2013, when armed groups occupied the ancient city of Timbuktu in Mali and threatened the holdings of the Ahmed Baba Institute, a collection of approximately 300,000 manuscripts representing centuries of West African Islamic scholarship, texts that in some cases existed in no other copy anywhere in the world. The response was not a dramatic confrontation. It was quiet, practical, and methodical. Local scholars and cultural workers organized a covert operation to move the manuscripts out of the city before the occupation could consolidate its control over what the collection held. The manuscripts were wrapped and packed into rice sacks, into food containers, into the ordinary domestic vessels that do not attract attention at a roadblock. They were loaded onto trucks and driven south to Bamako, carried across a landscape under military pressure by people who understood that what they were carrying was not replaceable and that the time to move it was before anyone decided to prevent it. The gesture is recognizable. The logic is the same logic that appears in the historical record of a dozen other moments. Manuscripts wrapped in oiled cloth, placed in sealed containers, moved through corridors, while the sounds of a city under pressure came through thick walls, taken to a place of concealment by people who understood that the objects they carried would not be safe where they were. The specific century and country differ. The specific texts differ. What does not differ is the underlying understanding that written knowledge is fragile, that institutions are fragile, and that the thing to do when an institution is about to fail is to move the knowledge into a form that the institution's failure cannot reach. Those who carried the Timbuktu manuscripts to Bamako are known. Their names are recorded. They gave interviews afterward. The manuscripts they saved are cataloged, and for those that have been imaged, digitally preserved. The historical record of what they did is complete enough that scholars can study it with confidence. The people who may have moved the Fatimid Royal Library, or some portion of it, or the most restricted and irreplaceable portion of it, into concealment during the Shaddad period in the 1060s CE, left no such record, no memoir, no account given afterward, no interview. What the historical record preserves of them is their absence. The palace officials, whose names appear in administrative documents up to a certain date and then simply do not appear again, the scribes and librarians who served the collection during its last decades of documented operation, and who, after the collapse, are not mentioned in the accounts that describe the collapse. Their disappearance from the record may mean many things. The Shadat was a period of genuine political violence, of famine, of the kind of institutional collapse in which ordinary documentation stops being kept and ordinary people stop appearing in the sources simply because the sources stop. It is not possible to say, from the record available, whether the people who served the library during this period chose to disappear along with the manuscripts, or were executed, or simply died in circumstances that no one thought to write down. The folkloric tradition around the concealment includes a motif in which those who carried the books to their hiding place did not return from the task, a motif that is present in similar forms in many traditions around buried knowledge, and that functions in oral culture as a kind of seal on the secret, an explanation for why no one subsequently came to retrieve what was hidden. This motif is not documented history. It belongs to the oral tradition around the event, and it appears in multiple forms that are inconsistent with each other in their details in the way that oral traditions generally are. It is worth noting as a feature of how this story has been carried, not as evidence for what happened, but as evidence for how the story has been understood and preserved by the people who have kept it alive. What is documented is the physical landscape that the concealment would have had to navigate. The Mukattam Hills rise on the eastern edge of Old Cairo, their pale limestone catching and releasing heat across the day, their surface marked by centuries of quarrying activity that has left cavities and chambers throughout the rock below the surface. The area of Fustat, the older settlement south of the Fatimid city of Al-Qahira, has been occupied continuously since the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, and the layers of archaeological deposit beneath its current surface have accumulated over 13 centuries of building, demolition, rebuilding, and ordinary urban life. The palace complex of Al-Qahira itself, the walled royal city that the Fatimid dynasty built, beginning in 969 CE, and that served as the seat of their government for 2 centuries, lies beneath the streets and buildings of what is now the neighborhood of Gamaliya, its foundations intact beneath the urban fabric that replaced it. The archaeologist working in this landscape faces a particular set of practical difficulties. The density of current occupation above the Fatimid period deposits is not theoretical. It is the density of a living city, with residents, infrastructure, and the legal and administrative complexity of any densely inhabited urban environment. The work that has been done in the palace area by the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale and the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt has been conducted in the fragmentary way that urban archaeology is always conducted, in building foundations, in utility trenches, in the spaces that construction activity briefly opens before closing again. The stratigraphy of what has been found in these fragmentary investigations is consistent with the presence of undisturbed Fatimid period deposits in the areas that have not been opened. The floors and foundations of the palace complex are, in the assessments of researchers who have worked in the area, still there in significant portions, beneath the surface levels that daily life in the city occupies. The ground beneath Al-Qahira has not been comprehensively excavated. That is the plainest statement of the current situation. It is not a dramatic statement. It does not carry urgency. It is simply what the archaeological record shows, that a major urban site of the Fatimid period, including the foundations of a palace complex that housed one of the largest libraries in the medieval world, has been investigated only in fragments, and that the question of what lies beneath the uninvestigated portions has not been answered because it has not been asked in the only form in which it can be definitively answered. The Cairo Geniza offers the nearest available precedent for what undisturbed preservation in this specific environment can look like. The Geniza chamber of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat was sealed at some point. The specific date is not established with certainty, and its contents, approximately 300,000 manuscript fragments representing 9 centuries of Jewish communal life in Cairo, survived inside it in a state of preservation that astonished the scholars who examined them after the chamber was opened in 1896. The Cairene climate is dry enough, and the sealed conditions of the chamber were stable enough that documents written in the 10th century were legible in the 19th, paper and parchment and vellum that had not been disturbed for hundreds of years were in conditions that allowed scholars to read them, transcribe them, study them as primary historical sources. The Geniza is not proof that a buried library survives beneath the Fatimid palace. It is not evidence of any specific hidden collection. What it is, and what it has been for the scholars who work on Fatimid manuscript recovery, is a demonstration, precise, documented, and geographically specific, that the physical conditions of Old Cairo are capable of preserving manuscripts across the centuries in a way that would make their recovery meaningful if they were found. The question the Geniza answers is not where the Fatimid library is. The question it answers is whether it is conceivable that such a library could still exist in recoverable form, and the answer to that question, demonstrated by 300,000 legible fragments in a sealed chamber in Fustat, is yes. A manuscript recovered from a Yemeni collection in the 21st century and identified as a Fatimid period text was, before its identification, simply a manuscript in a private collection. It had a physical existence. It sat on a shelf or in a box, or wrapped in cloth in a storage room. It did not announce itself. It did not carry a label that said, "This is what you have been looking for." It became identifiable only when someone with the right training looked at it carefully, compared it against the bibliographic record, and recognized in its contents the text that a 10th century writer had described and a catalog had listed, and the world's libraries had held no copy of. The discovery was not the manuscript surfacing. The manuscript had been where it was for an indeterminate period before anyone looked. The discovery was the act of looking with enough knowledge to see what was there. This is the character of the search as it currently stands. Not dramatic, not convergent on a specific site or a specific answer, but ongoing in the way that patient scholarly attention is ongoing. New manuscripts are described, new collections are digitized, new cross-references become possible between texts that had not previously been searchable in the same system. The gaps in the bibliographic record become more precisely visible as the documentation of what survives becomes more complete, and a more precisely visible gap is a more useful gap, a cleaner indication of where to look and what to look for. The Ismaili scholarly tradition has maintained its own internal memory of the Fatimid intellectual inheritance through the centuries since the dynasty's end. The Bohra communities of Gujarat and other Indian regions, the Ismaili communities of Yemen, of Iran, of East Africa, have preserved manuscripts and transmitted knowledge in forms that were not always visible to the external scholarly world, not because they were hidden in any active sense, but because they were alive within communities that had their own reasons for caring about them and their own practices of transmission that did not require external validation. Some of what the Institute of Ismaili Studies has recovered has come from these communities, texts offered for scholarly attention by people who understood what they held and were willing to share it with a wider audience. Texts that had been copied and recopied across generations precisely because someone in each generation had understood that copying them was important. The manuscripts that exist in these community collections are not secret. They are known to the communities that hold them. Some have been described to scholars. Some have been imaged. Some exist in institutional copies in libraries in London and Bombay and Dar es Salaam. What has not yet been fully done is the systematic cross-referencing that would allow every surviving Fatimid period text in every collection to be mapped against the bibliographic record of what the Fatimid library held, the work of producing, for the first time, a complete picture of how much of the collection survived, and in which form, and in which community, and whether the shape of what survived points toward a concentrated cache somewhere, a deposit that went into the ground rather than into the trade routes, rather than into the hands of scholars carrying manuscripts across the desert to Yemen or India or the cities of the Maghreb. The dressed stone of the palace floor has not moved. What is beneath it has not been described by anyone who has seen it. There is a particular quality to the silence of buried things, not the silence of absence, but the silence of continuation, of objects persisting in the dark in the condition they were placed in, accumulating time without accumulating change. The cedar chest fitted with oiled linen, the ceramic jar stoppered with beeswax and bound in cloth, the sealed niche in the palace wall, its surface finished smooth and unmarked, indistinguishable from the wall around it. These are not images from a confirmed discovery. They are images of the physical logic of concealment, the forms that medieval manuscript preservation took when it was conducted in conditions of urgency, the methods that the historical record and the archaeological record both confirm were used, the specific shape that the act of hiding a library would most likely have taken. Whether those forms were employed in the Fatimid palace complex during the 1060s CE is not established. The record does not confirm it. The record establishes that the library existed, that the Shaddad created conditions in which its dispersal or concealment was a practical necessity, that the methods of concealment documented in Islamic historical sources were compatible with the site's geology and construction, and that the site has not been excavated in the way that would answer the question definitively. Everything between the established facts and the sealed jar in the dark is inference, careful, historically grounded inference, but inference nonetheless. The inference has been made by scholars who have spent years working with the primary sources, reading al-Makrizi's account of the library's contents, tracing the ghost citations in the bibliographic literature, comparing the Fatimid collection's documented holdings against what survives in libraries around the world. The inference is not casual. It rests on the same kind of evidential reasoning that any historical argument rests on, the identification of a pattern in the record, the assessment of what the pattern most plausibly indicates, the acknowledgement of where the evidence runs out and something else begins. Where the evidence runs out, in this case, is somewhere beneath the streets of the Gamaliel neighborhood in Cairo, in the unexplored foundations of a palace that was built in 969 CE and partially demolished, and built over in the 12th century, its stones reused, its rooms sealed or filled, its contents, if any remained, left in place by the people who closed the doors and did not return. The foundations are documented in the fragmentary archaeological work that has been done. They are there. What sits in them, if anything does, is not documented because the work that would document it has not been completed. Cairo goes about its business above this question, as it has for 900 years. The medieval gates of Bab al-Futuh and Bab al-Nasr still stand at the northern edge of the old city, massive, cut-stone structures built by the Fatimid general Badr al-Jamali in 1087 CE, their arched passages worn smooth by centuries of traffic, their upper chambers still accessible, their foundations deeply embedded in the ground that the Fatimid dynasty organized and built upon. The lanes between the gates follow the geometry of the Fatimid street plan, their basic routes unchanged since the 11th century, even as the buildings on either side have been raised and rebuilt, and raised again in the ordinary rhythm of urban transformation. The surface of the city carries its history in its geometry, even where the specific structures are gone, and the geometry of Old Cairo is still, in its essential outlines, Fatimid. Beneath the paving stones, beneath the layers of Ottoman period foundations, the Mamluk period structures, the Ubaid reorganization of what the Fatimids had built, the Fatimid period deposits continue in the places where they have not been disturbed. The stratigraphy is not uniform. Some areas have been excavated deeply by later construction. Others have been built over without disturbance to what lay below. The specific character of the deposit beneath the palace area is not known in detail, because the detailed investigation that would reveal it has not been carried out. A researcher working in the digital catalog of Fatimid period manuscripts might spend a morning following a single ghost citation, a text cited by a 12th century Yemeni scholar who had apparently read it during the Fatimid period, titled and described and quoted at sufficient length to establish what the text argued, but unmatched in any surviving library's holdings. The researcher would search the VHMML database, the British Library digital catalog, the holdings of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the manuscript collections of the major Ottoman libraries in Istanbul, the Ismaili community collections that have been indexed and made searchable. The citation might not resolve that morning. It might not resolve in a year. The text might remain a ghost, present in the record of what was written about it, absent from the record of what survives. Or the researcher might find, in a partially cataloged collection in a regional library, whose holdings have not previously been cross-referenced against the Fatimid bibliographic record, a manuscript that matches the description, an author's name in the colophon, a date of copying consistent with the Fatimid period, an argument that corresponds to the summary the 12th century scholar provided, the ghost acquiring, in that moment, the weight and texture of a physical object that has been waiting for exactly this kind of attention. This is how the collection reveals itself, where it does reveal itself, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the gradual accumulation of individual matches, individual recoveries, each one adding a small amount of precision to the picture of what the library held, and what proportion of it can still be found. The portion that cannot be found, the texts that remain ghost citations in the bibliographic literature, unmatched in any surviving collection, uncorroborated by any physical manuscript in any library anyone has documented, might have disappeared through ordinary dispersal and ordinary loss. That is the most statistically probable explanation for any given missing text. Books disappear for ordinary reasons. Copies are not made. Holdings are not maintained. Collections dissolve through debt, through neglect, through the simple failure to pass on the knowledge of what was held and where. Or they might be in a dry, dark place beneath a city, in a sealed container of some kind, in the condition that dry heat and stable darkness can create across a very long time, waiting for the kind of attention that for 900 years has not been directed at the specific ground beneath which they rest. Both of these possibilities are consistent with the evidence. The evidence does not currently distinguish between them. What the evidence does is establish that the library existed, that it was extraordinary in its scope, that its final period coincided with a political crisis severe enough to motivate concealment, that the methods of concealment were available and documented, that the site has not been excavated, and that the conditions of preservation in Old Cairo are capable of maintaining manuscripts across the relevant time span.